There's so many different examples, but I'm going to give you a few. Turn to Luke 6. Luke 6. And we'll start on verse 1, because I think people need to see what's happening here. Because this is one example of many where people say, oh, see, Yahushua, he did away with the Torah. He didn't keep the Torah. Yes, he did. He did keep the Torah. And it says in verse 1, and it came to be on a Sabbath that he went through grain fields, and his taught ones were plucking the heads of grain and were eating, rubbing them in the hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, why are you doing what is not right to do on the Sabbath? Now, did Yahushua have a problem? Did Yahuwah have a problem with us eating on the Sabbath? No. He had a problem with us gathering on the Sabbath. These men are not picking the ears of corn and gathering them. They are simply rubbing some of the kernels off in their hands, just as it said, off of the corn and eating them. What's wrong with this? There's nothing in the Torah against this. But people read it and they say, oh, the Pharisees had a problem with it, so it must have been against the Torah. But it's not true. This comes from arguments of men who are unlearned and don't read the Scriptures. So it says, and Yahushua answered them, said, have you not read what David or David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he went into the house of Elohim and took and ate the showbread and also gave some to those with him, which is not right for any but the priest to eat. And we know that the reason that he was able to do this is the promise which is upon David, which he would bring forth a king priest. But anyway, and he said in verse 5, a very important statement. And he said unto them, the son of Adam, which he is referring to of himself, and if those of you who have read the book of Enoch will know that there is a son of Adam who will judge according to the book of Enoch. It's called the son of Adam. It's a sort of code word for Messiah most of the time that we see it. And he says, the son of Adam is master of the Sabbath. So Yahushua told us in Matthew, Matithyahu, in chapter 5, that he did not come to do away with the Torah, but to bring fullness and interpretation, the interpretation, to interpret it for us, to show us how to live it as an example. He said, think not that I've come to destroy the Torah of the prophets until heaven and earth pass away. Not one jot, which is a yod, the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, or one tittle, which is a wall, which is the next to the second smallest letter, shall pass away from the Torah until all is fulfilled. So not one of the smallest letters will pass away from the Torah until all be fulfilled. And he then said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. And surely Yahushua has declared himself the master of the Sabbath. In verse 6 he says, and it also came to be on another Sabbath that he entered into the congregation and taught, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely whether he would heal on the Sabbath, for them to find an accusation against them. And he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man who had the withered hand, rise and stand in the midst. And he rose and stood. And Yahushua said to them, I ask you, is it right to do good on the Sabbath, or to do evil, to save life, or to destroy it? And looking around them all, he saith unto the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored sound as the other. And they were filled with folly, and were speaking with one another what they should do with Yahushua. Here he has a man whose right hand is withered. And Yahushua is the right hand of Yahuwah, according to the Scriptures. And he restores this man's right hand as a sign to all. Because Yahuwah gives life on the Sabbath day. There's nothing wrong with giving life on the Sabbath day. And surely it was Yahuwah who healed the man's withered hand. Again, in other places, Yahushua does many miracles. He heals the eyes of a blind man upon the Sabbath. But because he spits in the dirt and makes mud, which is against the oral tradition, the Talmud, which the Pharisees instated, which they elevate to the level of Torah, because it goes against that, because there is actually a commandment in the Talmud, which is their oral tradition, that you cannot make mud on the Sabbath day. There's even another commandment that you cannot put saliva in a man's eyes on the Sabbath day. Yet we see Yahushua does both of these things on the Sabbath day, because it's not against the Torah. It's not against the Torah. Another example of this is where Yahushua doesn't wash his hands before eating. They say, why do you transgress the tradition of the elders? And some unlearned men would see right there, Yahushua is doing away with the Torah. That's not a part of Torah. We've got to understand that the Judaism that was going on during the time of Yahushua had traditions that they had adopted in Babylon, which they had made law, which they made law, which man made law, but not Yahuwah. And Yahushua is not a servant to man and his laws. He's not going to adhere to the decrees of a man, but to the decrees of his Father, Yahuwah. So Yahushua never, not once, broke the Sabbath day. And if any of you Christians say that he did, well, guess what? It makes him a sinner. And if he's a sinner, how is he the perfect lamb that shed his blood for you? He didn't break the Sabbath. And most of you know it down deep in your hearts. And Paul also observed the Sabbath. People want to use Paul, just as 2 Peter warns us of, and take his words and twist them to our own destruction. They want to think that he was preaching lawlessness, even though he is the one that says, do we make the Torah of no effect through faith? And then he says, Elohim forbid. So he says, Yahuwah forbid that we do such a thing. But we see some examples in the book of Acts. Remember, at the end of the first century, Greek believers didn't even want to use the book of Acts because it shows how Jewish, or how Hebrew rather, Shaul the apostle really is, or the one they call Paul. And when this is Acts 13:42. And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And these words were being preached by Shaul and Barnabas. In Acts 13:44, and the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God, or Yahuwah. In Acts 17 verse 2, and Shaul, as his manner was, went unto them, and 3 Shabbat days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. Acts 18 verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Shabbat, and persuaded the Yehudim and the Greeks. So what does he mean in Colossians 2 verse 16? Because this is what I see, this is another argument that people throw at me. In Colossians 2 verse 16 it says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day, or of the new moon or the Sabbath days. Now we can clearly see he's talking about Sabbaths and new moons. These are Yahuwah's festivals he's talking about. He calls it a holy day, a Kadosh day. These are Yahuwah's times he's talking about. He says, let nobody judge you in the meat or in the drink or in your respect, in your keeping of a holy day or the new moon or the Sabbath days. Verse 17 he says, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. So he tells us that all the feast days are pictures and shadows and types of things to come. That all the Sabbath days, the new moons, are all pictures of things to come. And he says in that last verse, they're shadows of things to come, but the body is of Christ. That word but makes us think, oh, wait a minute. But something. When we use but, it's in contrast. We say, oh, you do this and this and this, but, and then you think, oh, but there's a but there. There's something that we shouldn't do about it. However, in the Greek, the word but doesn't appear there. That's just added in to help the flow of language. But it really takes away from what's being said, because what he's saying is, not let anybody judge you in these holy days or new moons or Sabbath days, which are shadows of things to come. The body is of Messiah. There's no but. It just says clearly they're shadows of things to come. The body is of Messiah. In Galatians 4:8, he says something else that I get thrown at me. This is another argument. Howbeit then, when you knew not Yahuwah, you did service unto them which by nature are not mighty ones or gods. But now after that you have known Yahuwah, or rather are known of Yahuwah, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you your labor in vain. Now what people send to me is verse 10. You observe days and months and times and years. And then verse 11, I'm afraid of you, lest I bestow your labor in vain. And people send this to me and say, oh, you're working works. You're trying to keep the Sabbath day. Paul warned us against keeping times and observing times and seasons. Really? Did he warn us against keeping times and seasons? Because in Galatians, if we read it in context, he says, howbeit then, when you knew not Yahuwah, you did service unto those which are not mighty ones. In other words, you were worshiping other gods. And howbeit now that you know Yahuwah, or rather are known of Yahuwah, how do you turn to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? What bondage? The bondage of other mighty ones in context, and of other gods, as it says in context. Then he says, you observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you your labor in vain.